Hello there, and welcome to this, the 11th edition of the KurosawaCast. I am, as ever, Robert Beams. I'm joined, as ever, by my co-host, Mr. Craig Ennis. Hello, Craig. How are you?
Hello, and good morning.
Good morning, indeed. Good morning. We are joined here today to talk about Kurosawa's 1955 film, I Live in Fear.
You got the name right this time. I thought we were going to...
the KurosawaCast, I've called it the last two episodes. Managed to do a smoother entry this time around. But yes, we're looking at I Live in Fear from 1955. It's an odd one. I couldn't find the source of this, like where this name change happened, but everything that references this film before a certain point gives the English title as Record of a Living Being. It's quite common to see this film called Record of a Living Being rather than I Live in Fear. I don't know when it was sort of rebranded or which is the more accurate translation of the title. I'm guessing Record of a Living Being is the more accurate translation of the title, because it's the title that Donald Ritchie gives it in his book, and Donald Ritchie spoke Japanese, lived in Japan, you know, all that kind of thing. I think actually, from other things I've read, Donald Ritchie was responsible for a lot of the early translations and subtitles for Kurosawa films when they came out in the West. So I'm guessing Record of a Living Being is the more direct translation, but it's known these days for whatever reason as I Live in Fear. It came out 10 years after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and there were a lot of Japanese films of this era that were starting to grapple with anxiety around the atomic bomb. It was a big thing in the Japanese news at the time. The nuclear tests going on in the Bikini Atoll near the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, and there was loads of anxiety, particularly around this time. I was reading about this. Apparently, there was a Japanese fishing boat that got exposed to one of the blasts. So there was a lot of anxiety specifically.
That fishing boat in particular was one of the sort of direct stories that fed into the Godzilla script.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's it's good you brought up Godzilla, because Godzilla came out a year before this, and obviously Godzilla, for those of you who've seen it, probably a lot of listeners have seen Godzilla, the original. It's obviously got its roots in hysteria about the bomb. So this is part of a trend going on in Japanese cinema at this particular point in time, and it's basically, this one is about Toshiro Mifune plays an old bloke. Toshiro Mifune was my age when he made this film. I think he was like 35, 36, something like that. But he's playing a guy who's and that it's very good for the film, because it's interesting. This is something I probably should have noted when we talked about Seven Samurai, but by the time that we're talking about these films in the mid-50s, color was already widely adopted in Japanese cinema. It wasn't long after this that people like Ozu started using color for their later films, but also like lots of mainstream Japanese films around this period of time were in color. And the reason I bring that up now is that, without wishing to get into the criticism to like the jump, like Toshiro Mifune's makeup in this film only works because it's in black and white. Like if it was in color, it would look ridiculous. But anyway, he's all heavily made up. He's kind of doing the 1955 version of like J. Edgar, you know, or something like that, playing this character. He's hobbling around. He's like in a hunch all the time, kind of this cantankerous old man. He gives as you would expect if you've seen any of the great Mifune performances up to this point, he commits to the gimmick, doesn't he? And he kind of he gives it his best. And then
it does. It's not. Yeah, you say that the makeup would have saved it. I think the fact that you see him in a vest a few times, and it's clearly the body of quite a well-built 35-year-old man. Does give the game away.
It does. You mentioned at the end of the last episode, actually, kind of it being odd that it's not Shimura in this role, and that maybe it would have been better if they'd switched. And it'd be interesting to come back to that later and see sort of how you feel about that, because Shimura is in this film, and actually he's kind of a framing device in this film. Like, Shimura is the first thing we see, and then he kind of comes in at regular intervals to comment on the morality of the whole thing. He's sort of like the guy going, "Oh, but come on, is this guy crazy? Is he not?" And then he's the last thing we see, pretty much. He's
a weird kind of plot device, really, because it's. I mean, so basically, the plot of the film is Mifune is a patriarch of this quite large family who own a foundry and are really quite well off. Large family. He's also got two mistresses and some extra children from extramarital affairs, and he looks after an orphan lad. I didn't pick up why he looks after.
Oh, that was one of his kids as well. He's had 3 mistresses, but one of them's dead.
Right. Okay. So there's this huge, and what basically he quite obsessively reads the books and news about the atomic tests, and sort of is paranoid about war breaking out again, and decides the only way to keep his family safe is to, first of all, is to build a bomb shelter. But then I think it's the Bikini Atoll kind of radiation fallout starts moving towards the place where he's built the shelter, and then he thinks that the only place that he can be safe from nuclear fallout and nuclear weapons is in Brazil, and decides to move the entire family to Brazil. And they don't want to, because of not wanting to give up their lives and the expense of it all. And that's pretty much the whole film, isn't it?
That is basically the whole film, and the central point of it is a sort of, but is he the crazy one? Because he's treated as if he's going insane, but it's arguable that the more insane thing is to just sit there and wait to be blown up by the nuclear bomb, and that actually the only rational, sane thing you can do in a kind of a nuclear bomb threat world is to be as terrified as he is by it. And so there's this thing, and that's something which isn't left to subtext, fortunately or unfortunately.
Yes.
Which is something which Takashi Shimura's character, he's a dentist, but he's
a dentist.
He's on some sort of like family court panel. And
I'm glad you said that, because I've put a question mark next to that. Yeah, so Mifune's family are basically trying to get him declared legally insane, and for some reason in family court you have dentist mediators who come in.
Yeah, I think at this level of court it's like volunteers, it's like local respected members of the community, I guess. And he's one of the 3 men who at the family court stage, because they make their verdict halfway through, and then he supposedly appeals through other courts that we never see. But what happens is that the Shimura character, the other 2 are happy to say, yeah, come on, he's insane. Like his fear is completely justified, but wanting to move all of his dependents to Brazil and forcing them all to move to Brazil, he's gone too far. He's insane. And the Shimura character is the one going, yeah, but is he though? Like, is he insane? And I think the thing is, without wanting to jump too far ahead, the film kind of undercuts this by the fact that by the end he is actually legitimately insane. Like, I kind of think if they hadn't gone to that point, then the question of his sanity would be more interesting. But yeah, that's the kind of point of the thing. So it's interesting. Like, we haven't talked about it yet. For people that don't know at this point, the gimmick is I've seen all these films before. Craig's coming to them fresh. And you mentioned to me, we haven't talked about the film yet, but you mentioned to me the other day when we were chatting that you didn't think this would be a very long episode. Yeah. And I'm kind of so that could mean you liked it, but you just don't have a lot to talk about it, or it could mean you thought it was dog shit, you don't want to dwell on it, or that it's just boring. I'm kind of interested to get the high level, sort of take your temperature on it. Like, what did you think of this film?
So I've got a couple of notes. My first 4 notes are, first of all, were theremin.
Yes, that's my first note. My first note is theremin.
Because there was some theremin music at the beginning, and I was thinking, 1950s sort of sci-fi theremin, all that kind of nuclear-infused sci-fi, and then there's some theremin. And then I've got dentist stroke family court question mark. 10 minutes in, I don't really know the plot yet. Like, I've got a vague, I know what this is about, but I don't really understand why everyone's sitting around talking. And then my 4th note is, I wish I was watching Seven Samurai.
Yeah, I want to, just because you brought up the theremin here, and I don't know if there'll necessarily be room to bring it up later, it's very odd because a lot of Japanese films, or I think Hollywood films of this era as well, the end, it says the end, and then that's the end, and the film screen goes black, it ends. This film has like maybe 2 minutes, or at least a minute and a half, of just a black screen and theremin at the end. Which I don't know if it was because they thought the film was so profound that they wanted to give the audience time to sit and like ruminate on it, which I'm guessing that's the reason. But it's very odd.
See, as a film teacher, teaching people who are maybe kind of sometimes inexperienced editors, there is a thing on editing timeline sometimes that students will put music down, and then they will cut to the end of their sequence and then forget that there's a load of music at the end. or they'll
Right.
move something and you'll get a black screen for sort of 30 seconds, and then a 2-second shot will pop up. And that's what it reminded me of, somebody who hadn't cut the end off their edit. I mean, obviously it's not digital editing, but that's what it felt like. It was the same sort of thing.
Yeah,
weird.
it's very odd.
Because I was looking at the timeline, thinking, "Oh, that's waiting for it to come up and going, oh, there's a good couple of minutes." It was strange, yeah. But there's no titles, is there?
There's not really, no. What I really like about the opening credits, or the kind of the opening shots of people milling around, is if you come into the film already knowing that it's about anxiety around the bomb, which I'm guessing most people probably know what they're going to see before they go and see it. If you know that it's this film about anxiety around the bomb, you get these shots of ordinary people milling around doing their day-to-day business. And the implication, the kind of unspoken implication of it, I think, for me, is that these people are kind of milling around like ants, and that at any moment their pointless day-to-day lives could just be destroyed by a bomb, and they're walking around oblivious to it. And I quite like that.
One of the big problems I had with the film was, so it's a lot of people sitting around sort of arguing about this guy's sanity, and the family seem to be much more concerned with his money than anything else, than his mental. They're kind of looking after their inheritance. You spent this much money on the shelter, what we're going to do for money. We got the business here, all that kind of thing, and they're all sitting around talking about it for the most part. And the big problem I had with this was that I'd watched the night before I Care a Lot, which I was really taken by. And if you don't know, the premise of that film is about a sort of predatory sort of corporate guardian, basically. She's a court-appointed guardian for old people, and what she does is she looks for old people who she can sort of get a dodgy doctor to declare mentally unsound, and then she takes over their finances and robs them blind, basically.
She's Britney Spears' dad, but for the elderly.
Exactly. And that film is full of despicable characters, everybody in it, like even the people that she comes up against when she kind of picks on the wrong person. That everybody is despicable, and they're all kind of preying on them. But that was really, really strong and dealt with very similar. I know they were not necessarily talking about fear of the atomic bomb or anything like that, but in terms of getting the fact that the family seemed to be far much more concerned in their own personal circumstances, everybody constantly asking him for money. I'd seen something the night before, that had sort of blown me away, based on very similar themes. So to watch it again, where he does this occasionally in his weaker moments, I think Kurosawa's films, although he's definitely not a tell don't show filmmaker, but he's got it in him, like occasionally, to have those moments in his films. And this is a film that has those moments more than the others I've seen, I think.
His most soapboxy films, where he really has a message he wants to give you, like I think we agreed, pretty woeful ending moments of One Wonderful Sunday, or long sections of Scandal. There are certainly bits where people stand up on their almost literal soapbox and tell the audience that they should be earnestly considering this problem. And he manages to avoid that in some, like, for example, Drunken Angel is a social problem film about like gangsterism, and he doesn't really end up having too many monologues where people stand up and say, we've got a real problem with gangsters in this day and age. And that's one of the reasons probably that's one of the stronger sort of post-war films. But like in a few of them, he definitely falls into that trap, and I think that's definitely one of them here. I think something.
But there are moments of sort of of visual kind of storytelling that I liked. I've done a really crude sketch here of there's a scene shortly after they come back from the court for the first time, where Mifune sat with a couple of his family members with his back to the camera, and they're sort of talking about him to each other. He sat in the middle of the frame with his back to camera, and they're sat in profile. And it's quite sustained, this conversation, but they sort of talk around the whole issue. He kind of says his part, but they talk around the issue from their perspective, kind of ignoring him almost, and kind of putting their own agenda across. And I thought that was nicely staged.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been watching a lot of films recently, 1950s Japanese cinema, quite domestic stuff. I've obviously seen a lot of Ozu, but also like been watching a lot of Naruse, been watching some Mizoguchi from the period and other things as well. And it's interesting because you don't normally see Kurosawa tackle this like domestic drama situation. And something I found interesting about this film was that there are lots of similarities in how he presents the family and the house and everything with some of his contemporaries. But the difference is because it's a Kurosawa film, there's this big idea, there's this big dramatic thing happening. Whereas in lots of the Ozu or Naruse films, it would just be quite a gentle kind of slow boil thing about these people after his money, which is a consistent theme among a lot of these family dramas of the time. The people sort of worrying about their parents, using the inheritance in a way or whatever, and I feel like it's that kind of tendency towards the big theme, the big idea, the high octane, which is one of the things that damages this film because it doesn't settle into a gentle groove of a family drama, and it doesn't quite have the action, high spot excitement of other Kurosawa films. It kind of ends up in a weird no man's land, I think, between the two.
They're kind of they are like you say, they directly address the themes and concerns of the film. It's not a sort of well observed family drama in the sort of Mike Leigh mold where they'll talk around everything that's happening and you'll kind of pick out the family dynamics and you'll start to understand it, and like nothing really happens in something like what's that film? What's the film with the restaurant?
Life is Sweet.
Yeah, nothing really happens, but you get to understand the family and their relationships and the dynamics between them. Whereas this, it's so theatrical. It's so kind of like, right, we're gonna you should be scared of this and you should be thinking about this and everything is so on the nose in these conversations that they go on for so long that it's just becomes a little bit it becomes very boring.
Yeah, the characters in this film at various points might as well say, I am the son that wants your money. I am the son that is kind of meek. I am the daughter that thinks we should do what you want. Like there's not a lot more to them than that. There
are some nice little moments of invention though, like the bit where somebody's outside. They're outside the house at some point. I think they're putting washing out or something. And there's a flash of thunder, and Mifune dives for cover. I didn't pick up in the plot whether or not he'd had any first-hand experience from the war or being near Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but it kind of looked like it could have been in another film or another telling of the story that there could have been some sort of PTSD thing going on as well, I think. But
I think there's definitely an argument that it's about the collective PTSD, if that's probably not even the correct term, obviously, but like the kind of collective trauma of the nation following those events. And you definitely, I mean, that's the whole reason Godzilla exists, as we talked about, right? Is it's this way of exploring this national anxiety about the bomb that other countries, like, you talk to British people or American people who grew up in the 50s, they were very aware of the bomb and there was an anxiety about it, but the anxiety is very different in Japan, where they actually were bombed twice. And so I think that's true. I think whether he was adjacent to the original bombs or not, there is that idea of this trauma that he's kind of taking further than most other people, seemingly. What's really interesting,
there are also lovely little bits of business in there as well. There's a really great scene where after they've been through the second round of the court talks, he just comes back to sitting in the corridor, and everyone's kind of, it's clear by this point that people really want his money, but he just comes back and he's got everybody in a bottle of pop.
Yeah, I was going to say that's my favorite scene in the entire film. Like, I've written that down here. He comes in, basically it's after he has a really big row with them all, and he starts beating his son, who's played by I think it's Minoru Chiaku, I think's the name of the character, who I love. He's the fun samurai in Seven Samurai, and he's in lots of the other films. And he starts beating his son with his fan, and he's shouting at them all. And then the next scene, they're all sitting very somberly outside the family courtroom, and he comes in with like 5 or 6 like what look like bottles of Fanta with straws in. And he just kind of comes and he starts like, he's kind of bowed head, kind of hunched, and he starts just kind of grumpily handing them out to people. And it's such a true detail. It's like such a beautiful little detail of a patriarch who's not going to say I'm sorry or oh I love you all, or you know, anything like that, but it's his little gesture, isn't it, to sort of be like we're all friends here, like I forgive you all, like come on. And
it also just rings true. We've all sort of sat in, you know, maybe not courts, but we've all sat in sort of hospital wards or in official buildings where we've been waiting for an appointment and everyone's bored and someone goes, I'm going to get a coffee or I'm going to get a drink, just more out of boredom than actually being thirsty, and somebody goes off and it's a real moment, you know.
It is. It's really lovely. It's one of the most kind of human moments in the film. There's normally a sort of, we talk about the whole film before I kind of go more into the production side, but I think the production side speaks a lot to the film in general. Basically, the film was conceived. I mentioned during the Seven Samurai episode that Seven Samurai was at least the last completed work of with Kurosawa of the composer Fumio Hayasaka. Fumio Hayasaka developed cancer, was terminal during Seven Samurai. He worked with Kurosawa for about 10 years of Kurosawa's movies at this point, and they were really, really close friends. And during the making of Seven Samurai, Kurosawa talks about how he went to visit Hayasaka when he was dying. And Hayasaka had this idea for this film, basically. Like Hayasaka on seemingly not everywhere, like not in the credits and stuff, but on Letterboxd, Hayasaka is actually credited as one of the writers of the film because Hayasaka came up with the concept of it with Kurosawa, and they talked about this idea of this worry about the bomb. I think there were quotes in there about how Hayasaka had told Kurosawa about how he's dying, but he doesn't know how he could live anyway, based on what's going on with the bomb and how frightening it all is. And they kind of had this idea for this movie. And what's kind of interesting about it is that it was conceived, and I think this is a common Kurosawa problem in the social issue films like we talked about, but the film was conceived as a satire. And the film was going to be entirely satirical and pitched more towards absurd, well, I don't know, absurd comedy, but comedy, satirical comedy anyway. And Kurosawa found that he was so earnestly attached to the theme, especially because of the death of his friend during the production and all of this, that he couldn't do it as a satire. Like he just couldn't face it. And he talks about how, a quote I've got from him here, when one is as involved as we were, it's very difficult to keep one's distance. It was very hard to keep it satirical. And he talks about how in the end, they ended up making more of a straightforward social problem film. And I think that's part of the issues you can see in it. Like some of it's so heightened, like the idea of him eventually going mad and being in the mental hospital at the end and talking about how he thinks he's on another planet, and those amazing shots of him looking at the sun and think it's the earth burning, and the whole concept of him wanting to uproot his entire family, including his mistresses and their children, and take everybody to a place in Brazil. Those things fit very neatly into a satire, and there's probably a satire film in there somewhere that's quite funny. But then
like Mando and Anucci would have done a real good job with that kind of thing, I think.
Exactly. But he can't commit to the bit, and he kind of ends up in between. It becomes the very earnest social problem film that I don't think hits. And he talks about how when they were finished making it, he talks about how they were very proud. They thought they'd done this great thing and brought this great thing to life, and they wanted a film they could really be proud of to make this statement. And I wonder as well how much of that is lost in translation, because I expect we find this film, I think both of us find this film watching it in 2021 quite boring, and that there are films that and there are films, there are other films about the bomb, even in the context of Japan at the time, like Godzilla, that are far more interesting and hold up better. I wonder whether this worked better at the time for that audience. I will undercut that question by now saying that it was also a financial disaster and the audiences didn't go and see it. So I guess not. But I was trying to
I mean, you know, just because it wasn't popular, it doesn't mean it didn't necessarily resonate. But it just, I've put here, I've put a note here, and I think this refers to Shimura and his two friends who are debating the merits of the case, whether or not this guy's insane. And I've put, it's like they've seen a really interesting film, but we haven't.
He is struck by this is a bit of a tangent,
and it is great because there's so much, like you say, there's so much material in terms of this guy's the family dynamics, like just the kind of the patriarchal kind of dynamics, but also the idea that the family and the kind of the mistresses and the other children would all have to be together. There's so much you could mine from it, and I don't know. It does. It feels like it's a first draft, or it's the ideas that have been thrown together, and it's like, wouldn't it be? It does feel like somebody said this would be a really good idea for a film and hasn't filled through from it. It just doesn't pay off. It's too stagey. It's too talky, and it's Mifune's miscast. Like when you see his physicality out in certain bits of the costume, the makeup does a decent enough job in black and white, and his kind of physicality when he's in proper costume is fine. But when you see him in certain bits of costume that maybe are a little bit tighter, or like I say, in the vest, and you can see that he's clearly a young man who's very physically fit, it just undercuts it. And
it does seem like
I would have preferred to have seen a film with Shimura in that role and Mifune playing one of the sons with a more rounded out kind of character.
I think that's better. I think Kurosawa was because you get this thing with Quiet Jewel, which was his other weakest film, I think, up to this point, or one of his other very weakest films up to this point, where Kurosawa was motivated to make Quiet Jewel on the basis that Mifune had been being typecast as gangsters, and he wanted a film that could show Mifune's range and this other thing Mifune could do, which ends up being the very boring central character in Quiet Jewel that Mifune doesn't really have any business playing. And it's the kind of, I feel like it's almost the same with this, that he had this concept and he's so married to the idea that Mifune is this amazing actor who can do absolutely anything that he probably didn't even consider the idea of just hiring like an old fella to play this role. Like it is strange.
Yeah.
And I do think he is miscast in it.
Or just rounding it. I mean, because it's not like Shimura's got anything to do. You like round out that character a little bit more, have him a bit more involved, have some sort of contrivance where the dentist has to spend some time with him, and make that dynamic. So you've got I don't know. There's so many other ways that you feel like they could have explored the idea in a more satisfying, made a more satisfying film. There are some great scenes, individual bits though, where films where it kind of breaks out for a little bit, like when Mifune burns down the foundry at the end. Spoiler alert. And everybody's running around, and he's sort of like, "I burnt it down. You were all arguing about it. This is what was keeping us here. It's gone now. We can go," kind of thing. But
it is great, and it does speak to Kurosawa's more broad humanism. That when the foundry gets burnt down, you get actually a bit where the workers who we've hitherto not seen at all turn up and go, "Hang on, boss. So you were just going to burn the factory down, and now we're all out of work, so you can go and save your family." And it was kind of interesting to have that pointed out, because I think a lot of films wouldn't even consider or think about the workers. It's kind of interesting that they pop up. And then it's probably one of the best bits of kind of absurd comedy and satirical sort of end of it, where he then pledges to bring them all to Brazil, which is kind of one of the funny moments. I think the Foundry Fire is really good. I think the scene in the asylum at the end when he's looking at the sun and he thinks it's the burning earth is kind of a cool image. The scene itself I think is really contrived, but the image itself I like. There's an interesting thing that I read in the Ritchie book about Kurosawa, talking about how Hayasaka actually died during production of this movie, and how after Hayasaka's death, it took everything out of Kurosawa. He didn't even know if he could continue. And he thinks that all of the scenes he filmed after Hayasaka's death are really weak because he didn't have the strength to make it and his heart wasn't in it. And I do wonder how much that's a factor, like which films they were, what sequence it was shot in. the other interesting thing production-wise is that for some reason, this is the first film, you wouldn't think it because it's such a stagey domestic drama, but this is the first film Kurosawa shot on multiple cameras, and almost all the scenes in this film he shot with 3 cameras simultaneously, which he hadn't done in any other film. And this was a kind of a method that he employed on this that he then subsequently.
That's interesting because it's the standard sort of multi cameras usually is kind of 3 cameras, that kind of sitcom soap opera kind of setup, which kind of fits with the idea that this isn't one of his most cinematic works. Yeah,
I would agree. There's also a quote here I wanted to bring up because it was very telling to me. He said, "After Seven Samurai, we were all tired but happy. After this, we were exhausted." I feel like you could probably relate to that as a viewer.
It does. It's a weird. Like we've talked a couple of times when we've looked at these films, like these sort of retrograde steps that he's taken after making breakthroughs, where he's kind of gone back and made something quickly, cheaply. This, I mean, Seven Samurai is really so far up there that I think most things would be sort of a step backwards. But it surprised me just how much this felt like one of the earlier films after making Seven Samurai. Maybe that's just a case of it took 2 years to make. It was exhausting. They tried to simplify things a little bit, and the context of his friend and collaborator passing, taking that out of him as well. That makes sense. But apart from the double act of Shimura and Mifune, who don't really get to be a double act in this, I wouldn't. There was no large swamp in any of the scenes either. So I wouldn't have, if I'd seen this, if I was doing an odyssey through Japanese cinema and not paying attention to the directors, I couldn't pick this out as a Kurosawa film.
Yeah, possibly. I did want to say one thing I thought was very good that reminded me of some of the best elements of Drunken Angel and Seven Samurai and some of those other films beforehand, was that I've talked a lot in his previous podcasts about his use of the way he establishes a space. And the actual area of the foundry is very well established. And the way that it's a kind of a square with a foundry going around it and a gate and a house that kind of wraps around it and the rooms in that house is very reminiscent of the village in Seven Samurai, of the open sewage sump in Drunken Angel. He likes these areas, not just where he establishes like a locale and a place, but where there's a kind of an open square, and then the other locations are kind of around it, looking at each other with the other places you've already seen in the background, which I think is an interesting thing. And I don't think it's as fully explored here as in other Kurosawa films, because the film doesn't take place as much around this area as in some of those areas in those other films. But I think it's still interesting that he kind of establishes a certain space.
It's the cinematic equivalent of sort of theatrical sets, isn't it? It's not to say that things in his films are theatrical, although we've spent a lot of time saying that this is very theatrical. But I just mean in terms of when you're on stage, when you're watching a play and you've got, obviously you can see the whole stage and sometimes it changes and blah, blah, blah. You've got a clear sense of what everything is. You get a sort of cinematic equivalent that's done through editing and construction of understanding the kind of, in a way that, I don't know. It's different. It is different formally to the way that Wes Anderson does it. But like when he does those tracking shots through a half-cut building, and you kind of see you understand it's like that, but it's just more organic. And I don't know. I can't really. I think another thing that's a touch that would probably make me guess this was a Kurosawa film if I didn't know, is the emphasis on weather at various points. The emphasis on the heat of the whole thing, which Donald Ritchie equates to kind of fear of the heat of the bomb. The fact you've got the 1 second, bud.
The fact that you've got a foundry at the center of it, the fact that there's the burning sun at the end, are all kind of part of this idea of this heat. but also you've just constantly got that thing of people mopping sweat off their brows, everyone very hot. You have a couple of scenes in it with like really torrential, like heavy rain, and these are things that you get through a lot of Kurosawa films as well. There was
It felt a little bit more contrived in this for whatever reason than it did in something like Stray Dog, which seemed, I don't know, I just the heat wasn't sold to me in this in the same way it was on the Sweaty Trams and Stray Dog or the beginning of The Quiet Jewel or anything like that. It just didn't. I know what you mean, but I didn't believe the heat.
Okay, I did. All the people kind of mopping their brows and running those rags around their backs and their faces all the time. I always love the way he sets that stuff up. And another thing I wanted to mention is kind of a stray observation, but it kind of made me chuckle and it makes me think about where we are now in relation to maybe where society was then. Although obviously this is Japan and there are differences, but it's the fact that at that time, somebody hearing this news, because they talk about how, well, he's been listening to the news, he's heard these things, and now he wants to build a shelter, and he's spending all this money on stuff for survival. And I was thinking, these days, that's just a prepper. And there are loads of them. And no one tries to declare them insane and take all their shit. They just go, yeah, Nan, like, especially in America, it's like, yeah, Nan's made a bunker in the woods. She's gotten a company in, and she spent $50K, and they're building a house underground in case there's a nuclear war or a volcanic eruption or whatever.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe that's why for me the stuff about the money and the inheritance seemed to be more prescient than the actual kind of the is he the rational one stuff. Maybe we've
gotten used to the idea of people going like preparing for for end of day scenarios,
and it's not just bunkers in it's not just bunkers in America, is it? Wind the clock back 12 months, and we've got empty shelves in Tesco's, and there was and even before that, like just another 3 or 4 months before that. There was a similar situation with canned goods where everyone was getting freaked out about Brexit and stockpiling and things like that. It's you also have these days. It's quite well known that the rich and famous are buying underground bunkers up in New Zealand, like luxury underground bunkers. So the idea of it being a mad thing to spend lots of money on something like this, it arguably still is. But it's something that's kind of been normalized to some extent. Sorry, 1 second. My dog is whining at me during this podcast. Fill the airtime, Craig. I don't know what to fill it with. I'm not a ripper. I'm not a ripper, Rob.
No, I just had to open the door. He was halfway through the door to my study, and he's just been whining at me for the last couple of minutes. So now he's okay and he's fine. So anyway, the other thing I want to mention as a stray, a sort of a stray observation, is that I really, really liked is the way that the 3 members of the family court, they're kind of ready to chuckle and kind of dismiss the case before they hear what it is, because they hear that this guy wants to spend all his money moving his family to Brazil, and they're kind of laughing about it. And then they actually read what his complaint is, and the way that they all change their demeanors, the way that they all kind of suddenly kind of fall silent and get very somber. And it clues into the idea, which I think is very present in contemporary Japanese society as well, from what I know, which is that the real fear about the bomb is something that older generations feel more strongly than younger generations do, and that there's a kind of diminishing levels of kind of concern about it. I remember when I was in Japan in 2018, going to the city Nagoya, and there being a massive anti-nuclear protest going on there, like a massive thing going on the streets of all these people talking, people speaking through megaphones, talking about the bomb, and placards and banners and things everywhere. And it was all old people. There were no young people there at all. It was all very old people worried about the bomb. And,
I know that things like Threads and When the Wind Blows were early 80s, and the early 80s was still very much a time of sort of nuclear paranoia. That was the tail end of it. up until the kind of the kind of thawing in the Cold War. And my sort of consciousness starts, if you like, around about 1988. So I don't really. I've got vague memories of but it's quite a recent thing, really. I guess it's not. I'm almost 40, but that kind of lack of in the Western world, that kind of easing of concern over the whole thing is pretty recent, really, isn't it?
And I think it's interesting seeing this film because you definitely see older characters being more like, oh yeah, no, he's got a point, and then younger characters being like, yeah, like we've grown up with this, it's a thing, but I'm not going to worry about it too much. And I thought that was interesting how that was reflected, and I thought it was quite well handled. But yeah, other than that, I don't have a ton more to say on this one. I think you're right. Any other?
I think we've said much more than I thought we were going to be honest.
Okay, so
much more.
I'm gonna do our customary high and low ranking then, where we look through the ranking here. So I'm guessing it's low on appreciation and low on enjoyment. I'm guessing it's in the bottom quadrant somewhere. Am I right? How do you feel about it in relation to Quiet Duel? Because I think I preferred the Quiet Duel. The Quiet Duel's got at least got that very interesting opening sequence. Do you think? Would you agree that it is formally better made than Quiet Duel? Quiet Duel is very cheap and shaky, I think.
I would guess so. Yeah, that looks a little bit. That looks about right. Where you had it before you moved it. There we go. Yeah,
there we go. So it's higher on the appreciation scale. It's like midway on appreciation, but very low on enjoyment. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk about then. We always
moving on.
Yeah. So
I'm never going to rewatch this. Never going to rewatch this.
That's the third time I've seen this film, I think. So yeah, that was I Live in Fear. It's something that in terms of expectations, because I'm going to ask you your expectations for the next one. My expectations for I Live in Fear when I first watched it were very, very high, and I was really excited because I am a sucker for any movie that's in some way about the nuclear bomb. And specifically the nuclear bomb in Japan. There's an anime called Barefoot Gen, which is really, really great, which is about like surviving the Hiroshima nuclear bomb. And there's loads of really great stuff about the bomb. And it was one I was really excited for. There's actually, Kurosawa comes back to anxiety about the bomb later in Rhapsody in August. And there's kind of a whole bit about the bomb in that. So it's, which I think, even though it's considered one of his weaker films, I think I would rather watch that again than this. But anyway, so I was quite disappointed revisiting this one as well. So let's move on. So next time we've got Throne of Blood, which is obviously the adaptation of Macbeth, set in a kind of feudal, kind of anonymous feudal Japanese kind of era milieu. You, as I understand it, you have a kind of affinity with this play in particular, right? Like, you like Shakespeare adaptations. You like Macbeth in particular.
I'm by no means a Shakespeare kind of aficionado. My wife is, but there's a few Shakespeare plays that I really like, and Macbeth is one of them. From having to study it at school, I really liked it at the time, and I've seen maybe 3 productions of it, various productions. One that's kind of a couple of updated ones, and one that was sort of more the quote unquote sort of traditional production that you'd do you know what I mean? So I know it really quite well. I've seen a couple of different versions of it on screen as well, and I only actually a couple of weeks ago got round to watching the Justin Kurzel, Michael Fassbender, Sean Harris, and I forget. I think it's Talia al Ghul. What's her name?
Oh, what, Marion Cotillard?
I think it's Marion Cotillard. Yeah, I think she's Lady Macbeth in it. So I know the play really well.
Have you, in terms of this version specifically, like there are some moments from Throne of Blood that are kind of iconic, and there are certain scenes that clips get played from. Do you know any of them?
Only the arrows, only
The arrows, yeah.
the arrows, yeah. So you obviously doesn't. It's not one-on-one battle with. It doesn't look like it's going to be one-on-one battle with Macduff at the end. There's going to be something slightly different. But yeah, I'm looking forward to this, especially after seeing Rashomon and Seven Samurai. I'm not expecting it to necessarily be particularly epic, although there are opportunities at the start and at the end for some sort of incidental battles going on. Well, incidental, but like there's the battle going on whilst the actual sort of action of play. I've looked at I've looked ahead at the cast, and I can see that Shimura's taking the Macduff role, which is quite nice. I like the I'm kind of relishing the idea that Mifune and Shimura are going to go up against each other in this and be at proper loggerheads. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this one. In fact, when I was choosing my film to watch last night, I almost watched it, but I didn't want to jump the gun.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we'll get to that one. You're actually we're probably going to spend 2 weeks until the next one, right? I know you're possibly busy next weekend, so we'll look to do one of these in a couple of weeks' time, and I'll be watching Throne of Blood again as well. I think for me this will again be like my third watch of Throne of Blood. And it's never been one it's really highly rated. Like, it's one of those films which is really high up there in terms of the general consensus on Kurosawa's best films, but for whatever reason it's never one that comes to my mind when I think of his great films. So I'm really looking forward to watching it this time and trying to get a new kind of Lisa appreciation on it anyway. So yeah, we will leave it there, and we will see you all then. So yeah, thank you very much for listening, and thanks for joining as always, Craig. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.